Hi everyone, I'm here with Gabe Salomon, a very talented musician and a spiritual teacher, and Shahram, a metaphysical content producer. Hi Gabe.
Hi.
Hi Shahram.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us here today.
Of course, thank you for having us.
Can we first start with, Gabe, your spiritual journey, how you got started with spirituality?
So I'll make a very long story somewhat short. Basically, around the time of when I was a teenager, I started to have a lot of experiences, outer body experiences, where I was contacted by groups of extraterrestrial and extra-dimensional beings. And during this time, I was in school, in college, and I didn't really have that much reference as to what was going on, other than the fact that when I was younger, I had a huge obsession with extraterrestrials and metaphysics and paranormal stuff. So I was having these experiences, and I didn't really understand what they were. I didn't even really understand if they were real or not real, but it piqued my curiosity enough to where I did further research and investigation into other people that were having similar experiences. So around that time, I was 17 and was having these contact experiences. I was having these outer body experiences where I would wake up and I would be interacting in a very lucid way with these extraterrestrial beings. And around that time, I was also, as I was opening up to more of these experiences, I was also having spiritual awakenings where I would begin to experience myself beyond the body and beyond the mind, and I began to experience the oneness that is reality. And I began to understand myself as consciousness rather than just being a human. So there was many profound awakenings that really shifted the course of my life in a day, where I would have these experiences that were deeply connective, and it sparked that sense of remembrance within me to such a degree that literally from the course of one day to the next, I was a completely different person. And as time went on, as I was more invested in the spiritual journey, and I didn't really even know that I was embarking on a spiritual journey. It was just that these things were happening to me, and they were paradigm shifting enough for me to continue to investigate others that were having these similar types of experiences. So as time went on, my contact experiences with extraterrestrials and extra-dimensionals, they also became far more tangible and far more real, and were happening more regularly in my life. And I remember that there was a few definitive moments where a lot of my skepticism or my doubt, it became no longer relevant for me to even stay within that particular state of consciousness because of how palpable and tangible and real these experiences became for me. And eventually, after sinking into the fact that, okay, I am being contacted by something that I'm perceiving to be outside of myself, that these things are happening, and look, there's literally thousands and thousands of people that are also sharing their experiences that they've had. Once I kind of settled into that notion, then I really allowed myself to be fully on board with the spiritual journey. And over time, I was called then to share about my experiences, and the momentum and the energy that was created from these very spontaneous awakenings and through these contact experiences, the momentum that was generated from these things, that it really began to just take off. And so I started to make videos and started to host different events and things, and it seemed to be very transformative for myself, and it seemed to be very transformative, or it is very transformative for those that really tune into what I'm saying and what I'm sharing. So, sort of my very long story condensed a little bit.
How about you, Shahram? How did you get started?
So I always had an interest in, like, at the time it was seen as like aliens, that terminology that's seen in like American culture. I've had that since childhood, and it was like a very deep and weird obsession with extraterrestrials that I've had since childhood. But it wasn't anything spiritual. It was just like a weird just obsession with extraterrestrials, even though I was raised in like a religious manner. Like, I was still very much in childhood in a religious school, but still drawing pictures of extraterrestrials and stuff. So there's like a weird contrast there. And from there and through like high school, I started just researching more science related stuff and technology, and getting very deep into just like the furthest levels of scientific understanding that humans have currently developed, and just getting very deep into that. And that happening from like probably around 16 to like 16 years old to like 25, 24, 25, and I had a pretty solid skeptical, critical, and logical understanding of how reality functions and how society functions, civilization, all these different layers of like basically the cosmic mechanics of our reality as we would perceive it. And I was also at this 3 years prior to like the awakening experience that I had, I was making videos of an extraterrestrial Zen master called Zylok, basically, and he's like a hyperdimensional, super conscious being thing. Like, I don't know, it's not even like a creature really. It's like an extension of like a super conscious spaceship thing that became this like embodied into this being to just have a different form of experience. And it was more like sci-fi, so it was creating like a sci-fi show based off of string theory as the foundation of like the science, but merged with consciousness. And there was really some crazy topics that I was just writing about and when I was creating this content. And so there was like a solid foundation of like connection, so to speak, that I subconsciously was having for these 3 years of making this content and just learning more about software and technology along the way. And there was a day basically in June 2016 where I basically got telepathically contacted by an extraterrestrial, but like telepathically and visually contacted by an extraterrestrial. And that like woke something up in me, like activated me. That's how I portray it, which really just changed everything. Like it made me see all of the like clues basically that I left behind throughout my entire life. And these like writings that I had a few months prior to that experience that were explaining like the backstory of this sci-fi character, which was what I thought it was at the time, and kind of just like validated everything that all these clues that were there throughout my entire life until childhood. And basically allowed me to shift my entire perspective as to like, okay, I knew that moment was gonna happen where that extraterrestrial contacted me, and it did happen, and now everything changes from this point on. And it shifted the information that I started looking at to more metaphysical or spiritual and multidimensional ideas and things like that are more associated with consciousness. And I was meditating actually for like 10 years before that experience, but meditating as like a more scientifically literate and curious person than like a spiritual person, using it more for like focus and clarity than I was for like spiritual connection. So I had a solid foundation of like developing my own consciousness before that experience. And then so yeah, that experience occurred, that shifted my perspective of being more open to these things that I was writing about that were more metaphysical, that I didn't even perceive as metaphysical when I was originally writing them. And then that kind of shifted me to looking more at like spiritual communities, more consciousness, and all these other creators and people that are like Gabe, that are doing these things for like yourself, that are bringing this information forward, and that there's a community out there. And through a bunch of synchronicity or coincidence, so to speak, I eventually got in contact with him, and we became friends. And I actually stayed with Gabe for a year. We lived together as roommates, and that kind of accelerated a lot of my own development as more of like consciousness and kind of being existing within the body, but not being only the body, and kind of accelerating that idea so I could have more conscious spiritual or hyperdimensional experiences with extraterrestrials or other beings, or with like source or God, like a God energy or consciousness, and that kind of just like it went from there.
And here we are.
Yeah.
Can you describe your, like, one of your most vivid contact experience, and kind of describe also their world, what it's like to be in their world?
Well, there's many different realms in which these beings operate, and there's many different forms in which they take, and there's many different forms in which their worlds take. Give me a moment to recall one of my most profound experiences. So one of the first very vivid experiences that I had was that and sometimes they can be very short and very simple in a lot of ways, but deeply profound in the feeling that's conveyed. Because when you're interacting with these beings, they exist in such a higher state of consciousness that just by being in their presence, it can be very transformative. So this one particular experience that I had, I'm just remembering this because it was one that I had early on when I first started to have these awakening experiences. I was in a dark room, and generally in these kinds of spaces, which I later understood to be on board one of their ships, the air is always very diffuse. So it's kind of hazy. There's this sort of energy, this palpable energy that's in the room. And so the whole environment was dark. And I remember becoming aware within this state as this very, very, very tall, probably 8-9 foot tall, blue being was giving me like some form of health inspection. He was like checking my eyes, and he was like shining a light into my eyes, like similarly to how you would go and to see a doctor for a checkup. And I remember becoming lucid, and it was very funny because my reaction in that experience was just that I became aware that this being was giving me a checkup, and I just kind of was like, oh, hey, hi, how are you? Just greeting him, and in that moment he became aware that I was aware of him. Because sometimes when we're interacting with these beings, they're very aware of us, but we're in this sort of days where we're not able to consciously comprehend what's happening in the same way that we are in this reality. So I remember greeting him, and he stopped what he was doing, and I looked at him. He was this very large, as I said, 9 foot tall blue being. He wasn't wearing any clothes, and he kind of looked at me, and I remember that he had a jewel like in his third eye. And he looked at me, and he held my hand, and he whispered something in my ear that I don't remember what it was. And it's not so much I interpreted it as a whisper, but really it was a telepathic form of communication, because this is mostly how they speak, is through telepathy, feeling thought, essentially. And he held my hand, and he actually kissed me on the cheek. And I remember in that moment there was such an amazing, deeply profound sense of connection and of family. I knew that who this being was. I don't necessarily know him by name because they don't really have names in the same way that we do. But there was such an overwhelming sense of love and connection that I just felt very complete in that moment. And so he whispered something and he got up and he walked through the wall of this room. And I remember just kind of looking around the room and just realizing what had just happened. The realization that I was very conscious and I was having an interaction with what I was perceiving to be an extraterrestrial in that moment. That realization dawned upon me, and then the experience kind of slowly faded. And so that's just one of hundreds and hundreds of experiences that I've had, but that's particularly coming up now because of how simple but profound it was, because the feeling of it, the feeling of connection.
Mm-hmm. And was it in a dream state or was it out-of-body experience?
With these kinds of things, it's very hard to define what is what in a lot of ways, because it happens for everyone differently. And so the way that it seems to happen for me is like I'm getting shifted into an alternate dimension of experience, where I'll be laying in my bed at night and I'll be there, and I guess I can consider it me falling asleep, but how I actually experience it from my own perspective is that I'm there and I kind of go into some form of like stasis, where then I'm shifted into these other realities. The next thing I know, I'm in my bed and then boom, I'm in this other place, where in these places there's variant degrees of lucidity that can occur within these experiences and within these particular dimensional realms, just depending on what's relevant for you and where you're at in your consciousness in that moment. But I'm just shifted into these places, and so I'll just appear in these different realms. And a lot of these realms are quasi-physical, meaning that I can interact in the same way, like I can touch these beings and say hi and hear them and feel them, but it's all in flux. It's very psychedelic and malleable in that sense. So in that way, all of these realms kind of operate differently and they're presented differently. A lot of the times, the environment that you find yourself in when you're interacting with these beings will also serve to convey the message that they're here to share with you. So, for example, you might find yourself in a school, and the school is your consciousness's way of comprehending that idea of learning, or a classroom. But of course, to our reference here in this reality, we might not be able to understand like a total hyperdimensional, fractalized realm where we're learning. Our consciousness within that realm creates it as, okay, a classroom. So a lot of these environments, they serve to enhance the message that is wanting to come through with these interactions. Mm-hmm.
And has it happened that you see the same beings?
Yes, a lot. Oftentimes, there's as I'm shifting in vibration and my path is expanding, I'm brought a different group of beings that I see, but there are a few that have come back time and time again throughout my journey, for sure. Yeah.
And do you see changes in them? Like, for example, we over the years, we grow older. Have you seen anything like that?
That's a good question. It's not so much in the same way that we experience it here. The way that I see changes in them is actually just based on the fact that when I interact with them time and time again, it becomes more real in that sense. It becomes, I notice more detail of maybe how they look or the qualities of their being. And so the change that I see, because the way in which they operate from a dimensional space that's beyond linear time. So, for example, I could, in one day, meet one of these beings that I'm in contact with at a time in which they might have lived 20 years within their reality. And then the next day I can have an experience with them, but with a version of them that is lived 500 years within their reality. And to them, they experience time not so much as a linear unfolding series of events, but as actually coordinates on a map. So they understand that by shifting the frequency of their consciousness to a certain location, they can just appear there and they can experience from that perspective in time. So once again, when it comes to like changes, like physiological changes or changes that we would understand, it doesn't function in the same exact way. So as I said, what I noticed is that as I change, I just become more aware of them and the quality of their being more so.
What is it like to experience when time is not linear?
Mm.
So for them, is it more like collection of experiences versus like a linear?
Yeah, it's more, so the way in which I experience it as I'm interacting with them is that it both seems like I can interact, or I've been interacting with them for many, many hours, or perhaps even many years, and yet it all goes by in a second. So that when I come back from these experiences, it's like nothing even happened at all, but paradoxically also entire universes of information have been exchanged between myself and them. So as I said before, it's all in flux. It's all very malleable. It's all paradoxical in the sense that it feels like a lifetime and yet it feels like only a moment has passed. But for them, the way in which they approach time is that, and more of us actually within this reality, the more that we expand our consciousness, we can begin to experience time from this perspective. But for them, it's more like, okay, they're feeling an inner calling, an inner resonance as to where they might feel guided by source, by their higher self to go next. And by virtue of them feeling into the excitement and the calling of where their soul wants them to go, they then instantaneously appear within that experience. And so that can be that can be pretty much anywhere, depending on the level of consciousness that they're at. So similarly how there's many different groups of beings that are exploring many different levels of consciousness on our planet, there's many different groups of beings within these higher dimensional realities that are also experiencing different levels of reality. So essentially, the closer that you get to the source, like the top level essentially of our universe and of the multiverse in general, the more malleable you become and the more you're able to shift in and out of realities without there being much sense of continuity. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but it's a lot of information to understand, but I hope that helped.
That was informative.
Yeah.
How about you, Shahram? What was your vivid contact experience?
So I'll go with one that's more associated with like children, I guess, like extraterrestrial children. There's a lot of information associated with people talking about hybrid children and these experiences with extraterrestrial children. So similarly to what Gabe was saying, those are more playful experiences than anything really informative. It's just like they're more affirming experiences for myself and maybe for them to open up more to more multi-dimensional experience. But it was basically a playful experience of like similarly to what Gabe mentioned of like shifting into like some sort of parallel version of the room that I was in. And again, this is like around sleeping time usually. These things occur around when you're sleeping, and it's not necessarily dreaming. I mean, we could say it's a dream or it's like an astral experience. It's a version of all of these things combined. There's different gradients and ratios of what's more dreamlike that's developed from your subconscious mind and what's more astral and is more like a universal experience of different consciousnesses interacting with each other. And then so a lot of these experiences are very malleable, and they're reactive to your consciousness, and some are generated by yours and some are generated by the beings you're interacting with. So basically I shifted into like a parallel reality, whatever, or dimension, whatever it is, and I'm waking up in this bed, and there's like a small extraterrestrial being at the foot of the bed, and it just like looks at me, and I look at it, and then it just like disappears, and then suddenly there's 3 more of them that then appear on the side of the bed, and like one's like has purple skin and is like in like a grayish suit or something like that, and so that one suddenly like it like shrinks and then jumps in my hand, and I'm looking at this being now as like a mini being, and then suddenly it like jumps out of my hand, and like I like go from the bed to sitting on the floor, and then there's suddenly like these little micro beings just like running around. So this shows you like how non-physical they are. It's quasi-physical. They're shifting and warping, and basically after that a bunch of them appear, and they're like running around. They're tiny, and then one of them like grows again, and then it like goes through the floor, and its head is just right there, like a giant like purplish head, but looks like classic extraterrestrial. And it was just a very very playful experience. And there's also though some feeling of that this is a representation of like being in some sort of like hyperdimensional zone, which to them is like a spaceship, but it's not really a spaceship. It's like a hyperdimensional bubble that encompasses their society that can also be considered a spaceship. And that in that experience that there is other older adults, so to speak, that were also in that experience. And after that shifted of like the kid in like half in the floor with his head sticking out, like that experience shifted, and I was like floating up, like disembodied, to what looked like more of like a observation deck of like observing this area that I was in with these kids. So everything just like then shifted in this experience after the one of these, what seems like a kid again, like shifted partially into the floor of this room, and its head was just floating there, and I was just like, okay, bye. And it suddenly then like the scene shifted, and then I was like disembodied consciousness and like floating up toward what was like this observation deck, where it looked like there was beings like perceiving what was, or observing what was happening in this like zone again, where I was interacting with these other beings that were all shifting. And I just like got up there, and then I realized that like, okay, like whoever was in this observation deck was like a person that I am in contact with. And the more I get into a place of clarity and like sternness in my own awareness, like solidity in my own consciousness, then the more I will be able to interact with more adult-like beings, which did occur as time went on. But from that moment, it was just like, okay, like I recognized that there was other more adult-like beings that I was connected to that were there in that interaction as well, that I then just like kind of acknowledged within myself in that moment, and then the experience just faded out. So yeah, they're just very. It's interesting when you ask someone to explain these experiences, because it's, as he was saying, they're different for everyone, and every experience that I have is extremely different from the next experience, and some are less physical, more holographic, some are more playful, some are more communicative. So it's a broad spectrum, and the more that you develop yourself, the more these experiences develop to where you're able to, as I said, be solidified in your own being, that you can be in these more influx realities where you're using your being to create these realities. So you have to have a certain level of awareness to where you're not distorting the reality you're experiencing with them, because it easily imparts your own state of perception onto these experiences that you're having. Similarly to here, where your state of being affects the way you're experiencing reality and what reality shows you, in a sense. And it's just more exaggerated in those dimensions or zones of consciousness that you interact with other consciousnesses.
And some of these experiences, they seem so confusing. Why do you think that is? Why not like a straightforward, clear experience versus some of them seem very outrageous?
So just think about your own dreams. Your own dreams are a jumble of subliminal messaging of your own mind, subliminally messaging your conscious mind, in a way, so to speak, unconscious or subconscious and conscious mind, which it's just innate for these experiences to do that. And from what I've gathered is a lot of the times they're like this because they're not meant to be like, you must do this and that and that. Usually there's some distortion with a lot of things that are like, you have to do things, or here's this information that you must abide by. That's like manipulative information. And I've noticed that in these experiences with these beings, they're very cautious of that energy of imparting their will, so to speak, upon you. And that is why a lot of these experiences are so just like crazy and playful, because it's not meant to be like, this is who you are, this is your job, go do that. And it's like, no, we're just here to acknowledge you, to help affirm your evolution of your consciousness and whatever is happening in this reality. And you could take whatever you want from this experience that we've added to it, and whatever you've added to the experiences in these zones of like amalgamations of consciousness blurring into each other. And that's a lot of the reason why it's so blurry. So think about your own dreams and how like weird those can be a lot of the time. And now think about that, but merged with other beings' consciousnesses, and that turning into a big jumble of things going on, of consciousness like colliding into itself and creating different branches of like perception and experience that are like groups of that happening. And we see that here again, like we're doing right now, but it's more solid, so to speak, and linear in this perspective, where in that state it's always more like in flux and quasi-physical.
I would just like to add my own perspective on that. So the more that you expand in consciousness and the higher you go in vibration, which is just a fancy way of saying the more spiritually oriented you become. Basically, what happens is that you become more aware of the fact that you are creating the external reality from within. And the rate in which the internal reality translates to the external becomes more accelerated. It becomes more instantaneous. So in these particular, as we're calling them, hyperdimensional spaces, these spaces where these extraterrestrials and extradimensionals operate from, the rate in which you have a thought and that thought manifests is very quick. So these, as you were saying, why can't these experiences just be solid or clear? They do start to become more comprehensible the more clear you become within your consciousness, because you're no longer subject to thoughts that are just kind of flying from your mind, so to speak. You're clear and you're more focused and you're more deliberate with your thought, and then therefore you can have a clearer experience. So it's with the understanding that all of us share the same space, And this is true with this reality, this is true with all realities, in my experience. We all share the same space, but all of us are actually living within our own subjective parallel version of what we call reality. And so you might look at Shahram and you might see a version of Shahram that I'm not seeing because you're actually creating a different version of him than I am. So when you're in a space with these beings, I might be perceiving it as they're flying through the wall and all this crazy stuff, which is based off of my own thought accumulation and the generation of my thoughts. But to them, within their own subjective experience, it might not seem that way at all. To them, it actually might seem more solid and comprehensive. So there's a lot of quantum mechanics and multidimensionality that are going within these experiences. And it all comes down to the understanding that when you're in these spaces, when you think a thought, that thought is going to lead you down a path, we can say. And that path is then going to create what you're experiencing externally from you. So that's why it seems so crazy, because you're generating all these random thoughts without realizing it. But as I said, the more you practice within this reality, practice aligning your thoughts to the reality in which you prefer and the version of yourself in which you prefer. The more you align your thoughts with love, the more that when you're in these particular spaces, you can have a clearer experience, a more comprehensive one. Yeah.
So to add to that, just to simplify it a little bit more, so the refinement of your consciousness as a singularized portion of consciousness, the more you refine that in this dimension, the more refined it becomes in these realities. Yeah. So a lot of those, I was saying, they're like affirmations that something spiritual or multidimensional is happening, so you could continue with the refinement of your consciousness to where those experiences become more solidified and you become more lucid and aware in whatever, like extra dimensional contact experiences or astral experiences or just dream time experiences. And again, those are all blurry, but I'm just defining them a little bit more because people will become more aware in each of these planes of experience the more that they refine their lucidity in this reality. Yeah. So
in that dimension, do you experience that the thought process is a lot more clear and focused?
Yes. It goes both ways, actually. It's all very paradoxical, as I've mentioned before. You have the potentiality to be far more clear and experience far more spaciousness within those realms, but you also have the potentiality to experience far more multidimensionality of thoughts, where you can think a thought and then simultaneously there's many layers within that one thought. So it's, in a sense, clearer, but there's also potential for it to be far more, well, either chaotic if you're not focused within yourself, or just vast if you are bringing a focused energy to that idea of multidimensionality. If you're clear and you're focused, you can have one thought, and that one thought can blossom into a whole array of multidimensional experiences.
And is it possible that some of the messages that they bring through could be manipulated?
The manipulation that happens from the message, or the way in which it gets lost in translation, so to speak, is from our own distortions. So when we receive it, now I'm not saying that there isn't manipulation that happens within this universe, but if you have a pure intention and you're holding a pure, higher vibrational state of awareness, then you are a vibrational match, an energetic match to beings that also share the same intention. So a lot of the times people are experiencing a very benevolent being who's showing them something or teaching them something, not with imposing, because these beings, they don't impose anything. They have no need to. They understand and honor free will. So when some wisdom or some message is imparted onto us, depending on our own distortions, meaning depending on our own negative beliefs that we have about ourselves and about reality, we can very easily misinterpret these as actually being more of what Shahram said, like, you must do this, you must do that, or like, you're in danger, or like, oh my God, this other person's in danger. All of these things are a lot of distortions on the message. And fundamentally, the message is always the same, whether it comes in a very complex package or a very simple package, which is just love. The essence of existence, the essence of creator is love. So let's share that with everyone. That's fundamentally what the message is.
It's a beautiful message. And some of these experiences, it seems like, at least from what I've heard, it seems like they are in the position of control, whereas humans usually are in the position like helpless.
So that's interesting that you said that. So until you're ready to interact with these beings and their realities in a grounded and mature way, then oftentimes there'll be certain protocol that's taken so that you can still observe and become aware and have evidence within your own life that these things are happening, but there's sort of a sense that you don't have as much free will or, as you said, control. And a lot of this has to do with two things. One, this protocol that's put in place on behalf of your higher self and on behalf of these beings that you're working with, so that you can retain some semblance of consciousness and absorb what you need to, but not get too carried away, so to speak. So that's one of those things. And the other reason why sometimes we have the experience that we're not in control actually has a lot to do with our beliefs within this reality of not being in control. So the more that, it always comes down to what you're doing in this reality. The more you transform your negative beliefs about yourself within this reality, the more creative control, the more clarity you have within these other realities. Not so much the other way around. It's very interesting. Is there anything? Yeah, anything you want to add to that?
Discernment is key even in this reality. Is like your ability to discern who you're interacting with and what that is, and the idea that realizing that if everything happens for a reason, so to speak, which a lot of people follow by that sort of terminology, or there's no coincidence or whatever. If you're looking at things from that perspective, then even experiences that you've had that are bad or don't necessarily feel good, they still serve a purpose, which is kind of what like he was mentioning, to like still affirm to you, and whether they're actually bad or not, who knows? You don't know. If you can't discern it, then you're not going to be able to know that, whether it's your own imparting of your own distortions upon that, or if it's something that's actually trying to mess with you. It doesn't really matter at that point, but there's always still something to learn from an experience that could be considered negative or bad, and for you to implement that for your own spiritual advancement, so to speak, or your own advancement of your own consciousness and your own lucidity. So and that's same in spiritual community, and like I don't necessarily identify as spiritual, but I use the terminology because it's very relatable, that a lot of these experiences, even just here, as long as you have a positive outlook on a negative experience, you still gain something for your own self-actualization and realization. So even with negative experiences, whether we know who or what it is, because at the end of the day, we still have absolutely no idea. Like we're just like, do I actually know who he is? No.
Do I even know who I am?
Yeah. So we kind of we're in that state where we're serious, but we don't really take things too seriously.
We don't land anywhere. This is just how we've experienced it thus far. There seems to be some reoccurring components of these experiences. But in no way, shape, or form do we really need anyone to believe us, or are we trying to preach anything? If there's one thing that we're trying to preach, it's just love yourself, love everyone else, be of service to this planet and these people.
Open up to infinite possibilities.
Yeah, that's all.
But to get back into that,
yeah.
So at the end of it, it just becomes like, what can you do with the experience that you're having, whether it's spiritual and whether it's negative or positive? How are you choosing to react to those experiences, whether you know what's going on or not, because there's something that's multi-dimensionally orchestrated, so to speak, for all the experiences that anything and anyone is having, and that how you're twisting that for your own growth and advancement. So like I could say that, okay, I just had a really negative experience of a really creepy giant shadow thing like paralyzing me and just creeping me out. And like, how can you be grateful for that experience? Like that's the trippiest thing that you could do, is like, how can you like actually genuinely feel gratitude for an experience like that? Because at the end of it, it's making you so much stronger into what you think you're capable of witnessing. Of like, okay, now I feel like I could stand in front of a giant monster dragon right here, and I could be firm and not afraid and be comfortable and content with a giant creepy monster staring me in the face. Like, there's benefits to that, and how you'll be able to hold yourself in a human experience even.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of people, I do a lot of private sessions with people, and they ask me all sorts of these types of questions. And what I find in the spiritual community right now, one of the biggest things when it comes to these experiences is that everyone wants to know about the negative reptilians or the negative ghouly, spooky, wooky, ghosty things, right? Everyone wants to know about those things, and they want to know how to defend themselves from it, how to protect ourselves from evil. But here's the thing, and I say this time and time again to all the people that are watching this. When you love everything, there is no need to defend yourself. Because when you love everything, when you truly find it in your heart to love anything, there's no more fear within you. You only try to ward off evil when you're still afraid of evil. For him and I, we go into that. We want to go into that. We want to put ourselves, and we do this in our life, like we put ourselves in these somewhat chaotic situations so that we can really truly affirm that love is our only reality. And here's the paradox of that all, is that the more you try to keep things at bay, the more power they have over you. The more that you go into those things and confront them with love, then you become the one to harmonize with that thing and to show the darkness the light and to integrate those two things. So this idea of being fearless comes from love to all portions of consciousness, to whatever shape and form that they come in. And that is very, very deeply transformative when you apply that in your life. So to me, when people want to ask me about how to ward off evil reptilians, I'm like, why are you trying to do that? Why aren't you letting them in and loving them? And people don't want to go there, but I want to go there. And that's been the most transformative thing in my life,
so it's
really.
Like unconditional love. Unconditional love. What does that mean under any experiential circumstance? And pushing the limits of what that means.
I resonate that with a lot, because I feel that was my realization, that you have to be able to look at your shadow side and integrate that. That's also a part of your personal growth. Not just like keep growing, but also look at your downsides.
Absolutely. Well, and learning how to love those things, and to bringing those aspects of yourself back into wholeness.
What are some of the different ET races you have experienced?
So there's many. The definitive ones that I can share about that people would have some sort of context for are primarily the Shikani, which are the beings that, for people that know Bashar, those are his people, the beings from Essassani. They're part of the 5 hybrid races. I interact with them a lot, and I've even interacted with the entity Bashar several times. More than several times, but several times that I can consciously recollect. So there's those beings, there's the Yael, which are another group of hybrid beings. There's the hybrid children in general, which is a very large group of entities. There's the Pleiadians, who I interact with a lot. There are then other beings that are actually from different parallel versions of Earth that I interact with. And the reptilians I interact with a lot as well. Not all reptilians are evil, as we like to call it. There's many, many hybridized reptilians that are very benevolent and very angelic. And then there's archangels and ascended masters and beings that are very non-localized. Like they're not from somewhere. They're not really part of a civilization in the same way that we would understand it, because they've evolved themselves to the point where they're just anywhere and everywhere. They're totally non-physical. And so in that sense, they're a lot, they're more non-local, more non-definitive. So let me see. Those are the primary ones that come to mind.
There's a lot of unclassified.
There's a lot of unclassified ones that it's not even relevant to know who they are or where they're from. I have one contact who is a Venusian. He lives. There's a higher dimensional, fifth dimensional civilization that operates within Venus, and I actually had an experience with him rather recently. So these things they come in and out. But yeah, the primary beings that I work with at this time really have to do a lot with the hybrid children and the hybrid races. And then, yeah, so many other groups.
How about yourself?
Yeah, I don't really I can't necessarily definitively classify any of these representations of these beings that I'm interacting with, and what they're a part of or what they're not a part of. I can't really classify who or what they are in terms of like the culture that humans have associated with.
Could be very non-definitive a lot of the time.
Yeah, so it's been like, okay, extraterrestrial-looking children, extraterrestrial-looking beings, which are different variations of like the kind of classic ETs that you see, but with a lot of different variations in that. And it's not necessarily like I could say that they are this or that. That's not how I experience it. I experience it as more universal and more just like multidimensional, of just like consciousness interacting with itself. And it's also from my own choice that I don't necessarily abide by the way humans are choosing to define these extra-dimensional or extraterrestrial experiences that they're having, and saying this is that or this is that. I'm letting it grow in whatever way it needs to without imparting like the human cultural biases upon these things. So yeah, it's less definitive in that way from my perspective. Yeah, and it's and one thing that is relatable that I see representations of the beings that he mentioned, or the classifications of these beings. I've interacted with stuff like that, but again, I don't really experience it as like they are this or they are that. They're just consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Ultimately,
yeah. And I'm consciousness, and it's one thing of consciousness blurring and interacting with itself in different ways, and that's the way that I choose to interact with it. And then if it becomes to the point where it needs to be classified for the purpose of creating some sort of system of change, then that's a whole other thing, where like you see in human cultures, like, okay, those are the engineers and those are the whatever, and it's like there's these different classes where then, okay, we need that guy and that guy or girl and all these people to do this thing. So like when it comes to that point, okay, like I'll conform to the ideas of classifying beings as certain things. But as of right now, yeah, I choose to be more broad in that idea, and also going into like more non-physical consciousness that we're interacting with that isn't even embodied in any sort of quasi-physical representation or solidified representation. It's just like an intangible fractal warping of consciousness or something like that. Like it's less, it's more of the indefinable thing that I'm talking about. But I'm choosing to keep that perspective of that less defined consciousness idea, but imparting that even on these more solidified characters that I'm interacting with, whether that's you or myself, and or hyperdimensional beings. So I don't know, that's more of how I choose to perceive it.
And what do you think their agenda is? Is it different for different races, or they all have something similar?
Everyone has a different curiosity, you can say. But fundamentally, the beings in which we interact with, in the majority of the beings that people that would be watching this interact with, it's for the shared purpose of welcoming humanity home back into the divine connection that we all share. It's welcoming humanity back into love, divine love, and getting us to see that we are part of a community, a galactic community that expands far more than just our reality and our planet. So they're here to assist. Now, most people, when you're maybe don't understand this in the same way, you hear that and they go, oh, so they're going to land here and they're going to fix the world. No, it's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is that they are here to act as guides. They're here to impart some knowledge and some healing when it's necessary. But it's very, very, very much up to us to take it into our own hands, to become more conscious, and to take action steps that will help the restoration of our planet. A lot of them have communicated to me is the fact that it's only until we reach this point where we're able to feel empowered enough and to really own our role as stewards of this planet and really get ourselves into a position where we're taking the steps to restore this planet and to bring harmony to the planet through bringing harmony into our own lives. It's only up until that point that they'll come and assist in a more physical way. And even then, it's never doing anything for us. It's, okay, helping where it feels necessary to help, never imposing. These beings, there are maybe perhaps beings in our universe that want to impose their will onto others, but the ones in which I know and I interact with have no desire to impose anything onto anyone. It's just, we'll assist when it feels right to assist. Mm-hmm.
What about you? What do you think?
Yeah, so if there's an agenda, which I don't really think there's an agenda with any of this necessarily, it's more of like whatever portion of consciousness that's inside of these bodies has a connection with consciousness inside of other bodies, and those consciousnesses are acknowledging the consciousness here, and they're trying to assist with the awakening or lucidity of the consciousness that is connected to those within these bodies to become more lucid. If there's an agenda, that's the agenda that I've seen. And who knows about the rest of it, of whatever other beings that have their other weird agendas, just like they do on Earth. But as far as the way I experience the only agenda is self-advancement and unconditional love for all of existence and experience and anything and everything. And again, that's what I'm also choosing to impart on it as my own intention and from my own experience, because that's what I want it to be, and that's what I want Earth to go to, is that place. So in a sense, like, not necessarily that I have an agenda, but I have an intention. And I'm sure that whatever that if agenda thing is that I'm referring to is more of a collective intention that is not necessarily associated with individuals, but it's like a higher dimensional or hyperdimensional state of consciousness that whatever is more in a godly sense has imparted a certain state of growth to occur that's like fractally going down through these branches of consciousness that are going from infinity back into singularized portions but are still connected to infinity, and then are like slowly imparting this intention of conscious advancement in a certain sector of existence, basically.
Yeah, it's perhaps simply put, it's it's waking up the divine essence in me, in this body, in that body, in all bodies, in all minds, in all hearts.
And only if they want to.
And only if they want to. Because ultimately, the highest portion of existence, what we can consider God or source or these kinds of ideas, it's creating all of this out of love, whether we want it or not. So whether we as individuals choose to acknowledge that higher portion of self or not, the source, the prime creator, is going like, it's all good. It's all good.
Hyperconscious singularity.
Right, the hyperconscious singularity, as he refers it to. It doesn't have a name. This is ultimately the thing. What we consider God and these higher portions of self, they don't have a definition, but you can understand it and feel it as you are a part of it.
And if the mass contact does happen in near future, don't you think some of the attitude, like if they already solved all the problems that we have right now on our planet, wouldn't that make us lazy that they have already solved them and we could learn from them instead of us trying to...
So you mean that if they came and they solved all of our problems, wouldn't it make us lazy?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a question?
Yeah.
Well, they would never do that because the way in which they see it is that they would be robbing us of a really prime opportunity to discover who we are as one tribe, as one group of people. Because if you don't, it's like this, if you have a child and you do everything for that child, the child will never learn. It'll just be dependent on the mother or on the father. If they come here and they do everything for us, we wouldn't learn anything. We would just be reliant on them and we would worship them as gods, right? That's human behavior. If someone came down here, if an extraterrestrial came down here in their fancy ship with their fancy technology and started to do all sorts of stuff like clean the ocean, people would start to worship them at the state of consciousness of where we're at on a planet. So if they back off a little bit, if they give it some space, which they are, and they allow people to come into their own power and discover their own unique way of navigating through life and their own unique way of service to the planet and service to the people on the planet, well, then that's a much more rewarding journey than just doing it for us. Yeah.
Some of your artwork that I have seen online, I see a lot of geometric patterns.
Yeah.
What does that mean for you? Can you explain that?
Yeah, the way that I see it and experience it is that these geometric patterns are sort of like the fundamental blueprints or templates of reality. So energy configures in these geometric forms from a higher dimensional perspective, and then those energetic configurations then translate into physical reality and create what we see around us. So it's like the patterning, it's like the building blocks of reality are these geometric forms. And each one of them has a specific frequency, has a specific encodement within it in that kind of way. It like has a certain message that it's conveyed. And through these geometric representations, we can then perceive higher dimensional forms of consciousness. So when people look at, for example, the flower of life, that's a very popular sacred geometric form, we're looking at that and understanding ourselves on a very fundamental level. Would you like to add anything to that?
I think that's similarly to how I would perceive it.
Yeah.
Where it's just like it's like a fractal coding of how things could potentially translate under a certain level of parameters from like a more intangible state or spiritual state of like fractal branching into generating like this cosmic system of reality. And it follows like a certain parameter which could be based off of some of these geometries. Yeah. And I'm not to say that exact geometry does that exact thing.
It's not so much like that.
No, it's just the idea of like, these things can be like blueprints for potentialities of fractal growth of different systems of reality, basically.
It's like when you look at a blanket, for example, or a quilt, and it has a pattern on it. That pattern is what is giving life to that quilt. It's what is bringing you into that object.
The quiltiness.
The quiltiness, yeah, the quiltiness of it. It's through those patterns that allow that to occur. So it's take that idea and then apply that to everything.
Do you think it's something generic at a cosmic level?
Generated at a cosmic level?
Or something that's understood at a cosmic level?
Yes, well, absolutely. I feel that if you were to observe these formations from a more awakened state, you would begin to have more of an understanding as to how, as Shahram said, the cosmic symphony is all interwoven together. Mm-hmm.
And one of the concern I have when I'm researching on this information is like some of these stories get weaved into like conspiracy stories.
Yeah, sure.
So if someone doesn't have deep knowledge into this subject, how do you avoid those kind of pitfalls?
How does it?
Like because when at the beginning when I was researching and when I would get into that, it's kind of like throwing the baby with the bath.
Yeah.
So it's
how do we not? How does it not fall into conspiracy theory mindset essentially? Right. It's a very good question. So the way in which we do that is we do everything that we can to awaken consciousness to a more heart-centered, loving perspective. Because what happens is that if you give, you see an angry man on the street, for example, or an angry woman, whatever, an angry person on the street, and you give them this idea of extraterrestrial contact. From their negative experience and perspective of life, they actually are not vibrationally or energetically able to understand a more heart-centered picture. It's like there's a mechanical factor of consciousness that won't allow someone who's very angry and very negatively oriented to actually understand it from a different perspective. So if we can awaken these types of people to love, then immediately love translates into a higher state of awareness. And a higher state of awareness essentially means that we're more open to the infinite possibilities of the multiverse. So it always will come down to doing what we can, in my opinion. It comes down to doing what we can to awakening those up to love, to divine love and connection with one another, so that we can understand each other, so that I can sit down with someone who might not have this understanding and go, well, what do you think about this possibility? And they go, well, okay, maybe that is a possibility, and it might not necessarily be my experience, but I'm more open to it.
It's also a gateway.
It's a gateway, yeah.
Like, I was a conspiracy theorist, basically, at one point. Like, it starts there for a lot of people, and a lot of people who are in this spiritual community, so to speak, or whatever this culture is that's developing around these experiences, they all they have some aspect of being biased by the truth that's being hidden from everyone, and looking at that and realizing that things aren't what they seem, and then going from there. But as you said, like, people can get more attached to that stuff, and that leads to more into what he was saying. But at the end of the day, from what I've analyzed based off of where human culture is at and why there's so many different types of people imparting this information at so many different levels, so like really deep conspiracy stuff, really like Buddhist or Hinduism consciousness spiritual stuff, or like kind of sciencey metaphysical stuff. So there's all these little entry points, and there's like infinite gradients of these entry points of people to enter questioning their reality. And conspiracy theories are one of those things. Even though they're a little bit like iffy sometimes, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be cherished for what they are, as they are a tool to reach certain mass groupings of the population, which they're not going to be able to absorb any other information but that at certain periods of time, as a gateway to then lead to different stages. So it has its function in this system of whatever's happening right now. Yeah.
So I just want to add, actually, the beginning stages of my awakening when I was a teenager were very steeped in conspiracy theory, and I feel that for a large majority of people that are waking up to higher consciousness, it's sort of like this necessary stepping stone that everyone inevitably faces, because when you hear about the government poisoning us and all the chemtrails and all this other stuff, you start to question what is real, what is reality, what is all this, and it sort of gives validity to those of us who have been feeling like things are not as they seem for our entire lives. It gives validity to that. I know for myself, when I got more into the conspiracy route, this was before more of like the more loving spiritual components came in, but as I got into the more conspiracy route, it's like, I knew it. I knew this was not as it seemed. And so it kind of gives validity to that. And then life kind of goes, okay, so you can see that there's more than meets the eye. That's an entry point for you at that state of consciousness. So as Shahram said, for the skeptical, sort of negative person, which I was very much like that when I was a teenager, that actually became an entry point. It was like, okay, based off of my consciousness at this point in time, I can understand this. So now that I can understand that there's more than meets the eye, life goes, but can you understand that it's even more than that? And it's like, okay, yeah. And then you just keep on riding that wave until, well, much of your understanding changes. So the conspiracy stuff can be a very powerful point in one's journey, just to see that things aren't always as they seem. Yeah.
That's a good way to put it. And if it's an entry point that could eventually lead you to oneness and love,
yeah,
why not?
Yeah, and why not? Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
And now exploring more from a skeptic's perspective.
Yeah.
What if this is not a fabrication of our own mind, some sort of like escapism,
right?
Because our reality can be pretty harsh sometimes,
sure.
So this could be like an imagination
yeah.
to make us feel better.
Right.
What do you think about it?
So my response is that everything is a figment of our imagination, meaning that we are creating reality at all points in time. So no matter which way you look at it, you can essentially begin to understand that all of this, everything that we perceive, is a figment of our imagination by virtue of the fact that we're the creators of our reality. Now, with that being said, instead of focusing so much on what's real and what's not real, and what's imagination and what's not imagination, I think a more important question is, can you believe in love? Can you actually believe in, and maybe not believe at first, but can you actually envision or have some desire to live in a loving reality, in a world where everyone treats each other with love? If we can agree upon that, then who cares if this is real or if it's a figment of my imagination? The message is love. So if you can get with the message, then it can come in the form of ETs, it can come in the form of Buddhism, of Christianity, of Judaism, of none of those things. It can come in the form of you just being with your friends and family and you feel a connection with them, you know. So yeah, it doesn't really matter the avenue through which it comes. And I'm not here to defend anything. I genuinely have absolutely no concern with how people perceive this or how people perceive me or whether they believe me or not. If you can get behind the message, then my work is done. That's the only thing that matters. So it all comes down to love, essentially. Forget about what's real and what's fake. Love is what's real, if you want it to be.
Yeah, I have a simple way of, I guess, looking at it from a skeptic's perspective, but it's like, so you're driving a car that was once imaginary, and we're sitting on chairs that were once imaginary, with cameras that were once imaginary, with clothes that were once imaginary, and it's like at a certain point, it's like everything that's in our current modern civilization was someone's imagination at one point or another, right? So I know we have to draw the line in certain places, because we want to set humanity on a certain trajectory potentially as a collective, which is from our intention in a more lovingly and harmonious and interconnected society. So it's kind of like, that's what I don't understand how sometimes a skeptic doesn't see that to lead to what he was saying kind of, is like every aspect of our current society is based off of the internal realities of humans and their imagination and their thought processes, which is manifesting itself in this seemingly external reality, which is then causing a feedback loop to affect our internal reality. So that's why you might see individuals like ourselves, which are just like pushing these really crazy ideas, because we're trying to catch up to the biases that humans have created for themselves with how they perceive and experience what was once imaginary and is now materializing into physical reality, and then which is now feedback looping into how humans are thinking and how that's affecting their internal reality, which is then affecting the external reality again. So individuals like ourselves and all these other hundreds of thousands of people that are pushing this sort of information, or more than hundreds of thousands of people who are living spiritually or whatever, they're basically bringing in something different from within themselves, imaginary, to bring back into the physical reality to a certain point where there's balance, where the physical reality is then like showing these representations of these mass groupings of humans that are bringing in a certain state of consciousness, and then that being able to create a new feedback loop system that is kind of out of the idea of like not really seeing how consciousness and the physical reality are one system, and they're not separate systems of like, I'm this and that's that. It's like, no, you're eating the outside world and you are the outside world and the outside world is you. There's all these concepts of like where it's blurring deeply, and I feel like that's something that's not necessarily fully acknowledged in a more skeptic perspective. Is like your entire existence of you sitting here is blurred in the context of imagination and inward and outward amalgamations of things going on, and it's like at a certain point it's like, okay, let's start to question things in a new way, because we're realizing that certain thought processes are limiting the advancement of humanity. Let's try thinking a different way that these other people who are weird are thinking, and see what happens then. And it seems like their intention is good and our intention is good, so let's try it. And I mean, it's happening already, but yeah, that's kind of how I feel about that idea of like looking at things from skeptics perspective, or bringing in another skeptic to look at like what we're talking about even right now, and how this could be perceived as we're psychotic, which that's fine. If you want to perceive it like that, that's fine. And I'm not going to say, no, I'm not psychotic, and Sure, I'm extremely crazy. It's okay. I understand. I seem very crazy.
It's, for us, it's totally fine. Whatever people want to take in or not take in, or however people want to define us, it's fine. But I think, simply put, things that are once considered magic then become science in human evolution and advancement. So just think about that for a second, for the skeptic mind.
How do you see all of this unfolding over next 10, 20 years?
Well, it's going to unfold for everyone differently, because everyone is creating their own subjective experience of reality. As I mentioned before, when you start to see from a more conscious perspective, you start to see that all of us, though we do share the same space, we all are tuned into a different subjective experience of reality. So because of that, the external environment's always responding to our frequency of consciousness and what we choose to create through our beliefs, through our definitions. So all of us are going to experience it actually rather differently. It's a hard question to pinpoint. I think that on a more global sense, a lot of the systems in which have defined our society for a very long time will begin to dissolve and new systems that are based more in unity will come about. And I don't know what that will look like, but I know what it feels like, and it feels great. And the other component is just that we will start to, as we awaken on our own journey, we'll see more people around us and more things in our external environment reflect our own awakening. So a lot of people have that question of like, when is the world going to wake up? And when are we going to live in this totally glossy, shiny, sparkly reality? The question isn't about when the world's going to wake up. It's about when we're going to wake up. When are you going to wake up? When am I going to wake up? And how quickly that happens is always up to us.
Yeah, I think that a lot of things are going to break down in terms of how civilization functions. And I mean, there's nothing, I can't really say anything too definitive, because there's a lot of people out there and a lot of information that is not revealed yet. And that's kind of how I feel about it. I feel like there's a lot of things that still haven't surfaced quite yet, but are going to soon. And it's going to enter into the modalities of human information transfer, basically. So what we're doing already, YouTube video, which is happening, and it's exponentially increasing. And that's going to have certain ripple effects, and it's going to eventually, I mean, it's already in the entertainment industry. Like, you could see a lot of it in the entertainment and media industry. And even though there's a lot of other things that we might perceive as corruption, or I might perceive as corruption or manipulative information, which again, that goes into more conspiracy side of looking at things, that there's a lot of information that still hasn't surfaced and hit the mass population to a certain degree for them to react, so then another big shift and transition can occur. And I feel that will likely occur in the next 10 years. Potentially sooner. And after that happens, I honestly don't know what's going to happen. But there's going to be a point where more information is leaked through all of the interconnected devices that are here to serve a very clear purpose of sharing information. And that information will be shared and dispersed, and it will be what we as a collective will recognize as the truth. And there will be enough evidence, so to speak, for it to be a proof or an actual evidence for whatever it's going to be. I'm not saying I know what that is. And that'll cause a mass something. Who knows what that's going to be? Maybe it might be chaos, it might be harmony at first, who knows?
Maybe a mixture of both.
Maybe a mixture of both. So something dramatic is going to happen, and it's going to be perceived as dramatic by the mass population.
Well, and there's already tons of drama that are happening now. If you look around our world,
a lot of it's already, and a lot of it is already happening. Yes, yes. There's a very big portion of it that is already occurring right now, and it's being exposed. I'm not gonna say specifically what those things are, but they've already entered mainstream media to one degree or another, and it's just the beginning. And we're seeing how people are reacting in different ways. And I mean, being born and raised in America, like I have an American bias, but eventually all of this is going to hit other parts of the world as well. And it's not necessarily, its root is not necessarily going to be America. I don't think its root is going to be anything, but America will probably have a big effect after whatever happens with Americans and people who speak English. Like, whatever happens with the English speakers, let's say, and the information that's dispersed through the mediums of technology that humans currently have. And that is going to then cause a global effect of some sort, because the information is going to get translated into all the different types of humans and the different civilizations and societies. So yeah, I know it's pretty vague, but like, I can't like tell you exactly what's gonna happen. I don't think anyone really can. It's just,
we get glimpses of it and some information, but ultimately we'll all find out, really.
Yeah. At the end of it, from like what he was originally saying, it starts with self-growth, and that's what every culture says.
Talking about big shift, what are your thoughts on this idea called universal basic income, where everyone gets basic income for rent and food, so people don't have to work for the sake of working? Do you think it's a good idea or a bad idea?
Well, we've had actually many conversations about this recently. I'm not sure if I have any fully formulated thoughts on it quite yet. I don't know. What do you have to say?
So I'm not going to say it's bad or good, or if it should or shouldn't be implemented as something to adapt the current system of, I guess, economy and commerce. I mean, I would be curious to see what would happen in society, and if people how they would take advantage of that for the good of themselves and society, or for the detriment of themselves and society. Because on the surface, that sounds great. Okay, everyone gets a universal basic income, they have a certain housing, and they get food, and they get transportation through that. But then what our conversation went to is like, okay, so then what happens? So after that universal basic income, then what do people do then to acclimate basically life points, thinking of it like a video game.
Life points.
Yeah, life points, and like what creative outlooks they're doing, and then how value is created through people's creativity and how that's rewarded in the system. So like the entire infrastructure of capitalism and stuff is going to have to change and adapt with the idea of a universal basic income. And I don't necessarily think that's the best thing for society, is to use exactly the same system we have, but then just like give people everything in a new way. And like it sounds good on the surface, but it can also be very problematic. And I mean, it could be a temporary start just to like try to push in a certain direction and see what happens, and see what people do with that freedom of having a livelihood without anything. And also another aspect of that is the universal basic income only for America, or is it for the entire world, and is the currency unified in the entire in a planetary sense? That I think is a big like difference. If it's okay, this country is going to do that, or it's like, no, this is a planetary change. And that idea in itself is going to be drastic in what a universal basic income is going to provide. And then again, the idea that I was mentioning about like how creativity is valued and rewarded. Like, oh, okay, this person got these votes for their thing by the collective of people, and they get more life points for that they could do really cool things with, or whatever they want with. And then like, but what we were talking about with that, then that's also capitalism to some degree. And
I believe like, China actually has some sort of system that's similar to that right now.
There was something about like them having like a rating system for their citizens, something and things like that, like a social government, social network thing or something. But yeah, what I'm thinking, I think, is a little bit different, because I don't know if theirs is associated necessarily with like determining the monetary value of a person, but just their functional value, which I guess it can be similar, like what a person's functional value is in terms of social function and or artistic function or scientific function, etc., and how that is then rewarded on a universal basic income system. Because like people are always going to create things. And it's like, okay, so does everyone just create things and no one gets any value from that, and everyone just gets universal basic income? But that destroys the idea of capitalism, and then that's not necessarily a good thing if capitalism is destroyed and there isn't like a motivation for people to innovate morally,
Yeah.
so, and things like that. So this is kind of what we spoke about, and at the end of it, we're kind of just like, it might be something that's worth trying for humanity, but it's not necessarily like a final thing of harmony that is going to make humanity harmonious and whatever perfect means to whoever is relatively perceiving the system of how humanity is functioning. So it's a cool idea, and it would be cool to see it implemented to some degree and have more of collaboration on how a system like that would be developed and how value would be determined, and just changing the entire system, but also being careful that you're not creating like really like manipulative systems or degrading systems, or like I was mentioning like a voting system, so that could degrade a lot of artists who love creating things, but no one's acknowledging their work under this new system or whatever, and then like what that's going to do to people. And so it's like, how do we do everything where everything that everyone is doing is cherished while still having a universal basic income? And I think that no one really knows that right now. It's like, how do we cherish the kids' fridge drawing, and then like the Marvel movies, like how just using that as like something that's really glorified in American culture right now, upon many other things, like the contrast between those two pieces of human creation and how the value is determined for these different states of creation based off of the energy input, the collaboration of humans. So one kid drawing on a piece of paper, but that paper also came from all these other collaborations of people doing things, and then versus like a very high production animated movie where there's so much conscious energy going into that creative energy, electrical energy, and how that's affecting all these other aspects. So there's so many different pieces to the puzzle that I think that it would be a cool thing to implement, but it needs a lot of analysis and collaboration and co-creation and co-conscious effort from like everyone's perspective, basically, to like see how that can be implemented for the good of everyone without causing really detrimental things to occur for individuals or for groups or the collective.
Yeah, it really does come back to that fundamental idea of shifting consciousness. Because right now I feel that where we're at as a humanity, if we were to have universal basic income right now, we're not really collectively in a place where we're taking any sort of responsibility for our behaviors or for, even on an energetic level, for our thoughts and what we're projecting. So having sort of getting it handed, getting it for free, without any effort in this kind of thing, right now, because we can't even really take responsibility for ourselves, we're going to probably use that. The majority of people would probably use that not for the benefit of the whole, but just to further degrade their lives. It might not be a good choice for the vast majority of people, because then they would just not do anything, and they would just watch more TV.
Yeah, and self-harm.
And self-harm and eat more cheeseburgers or whatever it is. So we really have to, for that system to work, we have to evolve our consciousness. We have to be really focused on why we're doing the thing that we're doing. And we have to align our intention to be of service to this planet and really forward the evolution of humanity. Because then, if we're in a world where everyone's working on behalf of evolving each other and bettering ourselves, then yeah, universal income is great, because then we would just put all of those resources into totally accelerating our lives in every way possible. But we have to shift before we can use that appropriately.
And maybe they could start with like small tests with groups of people and see how it affects people.
That could be good. That could be really good. Just smaller, more controlled tests of that could probably lead to a lot of different results. But it's a stepping stone. But that in of itself shifting things externally within our world is not going to change the world. That's the whole thing. It's like people want to focus on external systems that want to change the world, which is powerful and it's a part of it, but you have to shift yourself. You have to be able to move into an integrative space of love and co-creation with others before any of those external systems work. Even if we had the most amazing and accurate and beautiful system that totally dealt with all the trash in our world, if you're not evolved to the point where you understand taking responsibility for your actions, then you're still going to have people that are just going to continue to throw trash on the street. So that's not actually a solution, you know.
And this is a little off topic,
Sure.
But it reminds me one of the things that you said in your video about to make your internal shift, it's not all those things with third eye or chakras, it's not really necessary.
No. Well, yeah, so I mean, a lot of people in the spiritual paradigm, it's kind of funny because this, in the same vein of, oh, we should shift these systems so that we can live in a better world, we do that with spiritual ideas. We externalize these spiritual ideas and we go, well, if my chakras can be aligned, if my third eye can be turned on, then that must mean that I'll be enlightened, I'll be awakened, and that I'll be living in a nice reality. This is a very indirect approach because all of your chakras, all of your energy systems, all of your negative identifications with yourself change through love and integration and awareness. So if you want to shift something in your life, if you want to shift overwhelming frustration in your life, you don't then try to focus on your root chakra because frustration must stem from the root chakra, and if I could just get this thing to spin right, you know, it's not like that. If frustration is arising and you're honoring that frustration and you're welcoming that frustration as an equal part of the divine whole, and you use that love to bring more awareness to the frustration, then the imbalances in your spiritual body, your physical body, and in your life in general, they start to balance themselves out naturally. So I always say it's about getting your order of operations right. Yeah, you can go to an energy Reiki healer and they can balance out your chakras and that might help. But if you haven't addressed the root of the issue, which is essentially discovering what that limited negative identification, emotional attachment is, and then bringing love to it, if you haven't gone through that process, then you can go to a Reiki healer, but in a day or two, your energy field is still going to be in balance. It's just going to go back to that imbalance because you haven't addressed what you're generating from within. And
you said something similar about the spiritual ideas of twin flames or soulmates. Yeah.
So I'm in a beautiful relationship with someone. And so, you know, first and foremost, my idea of soulmates or my idea of twin flames isn't to negate relationships or anything. But see, we have this idea where it's like, if I can just meet that special someone, then my life will be totally complete because all I've been looking for my entire life has been my soulmate or my twin flame. So for me, in my reality, this idea doesn't even exist because literally everything that I see, everything that I see, everyone that I interact with is my soulmate because I understand them to be an extension of my soul. So when you enter into this state of consciousness, that idea dissolves. There is a certain component that you get together with souls who are part of a family, and that there is a deeper connection with these kinds of people. But even with that idea, you start to realize that even with that idea, everyone is my soulmate. Even if Shahram is my best friend and we've been traversing the cosmos with one another for a really long time, it doesn't mean that that relationship is any more special than the relationship that I have with you or the relationship that I have with this carpet here. Everything is an extension of me. Everything is a byproduct of my consciousness, and therefore it deserves an equal amount of love and respect. So when that happens, you're not looking for that special someone because every single person that you meet is that special someone.
That's a very beautiful message.
Thank you.
Is there anything you would like to share with the audience that resonates with you today? You feel like sharing?
Yeah, okay. There was one thing that was coming to me earlier, and it might be beneficial for some people that are watching this. When we have this idea of ascension and awakening, in order to understand this, it's important to understand it through the number 3, the Trinity. So a lot of people, we go through 3 primary phases. And every time that these 3 phases complete themselves on one stage of the journey, you move into the next stage of the journey. And those 3 primary stages are, if you can think about it as a triangle, you have getting lost in form, you have waking up from form, and when I say form, I mean the illusion of the physical reality in your identification with yourself as a body and a mind. So you have getting lost in form, becoming non-attached to form or waking up from form, and then you have the integration of form and non-form, or the physical and the spiritual. So if you look at your life, you might start to notice that in every cycle of your life, you go through this trinity. So when you first start to wake up, when you're not awakened, you're identified with form. You're lost in it. You don't know yourself beyond it. When you start to wake up out of your ego, then you kind of want nothing to do with the world, right? But then you find this integrative point of balance where you actually come back to the world. You come back into your body, and you have this balance point of being in the world but not being of the world. And so always the message is just that this cycle, this trinity, happens at every level of consciousness. When you've integrated this idea at one point of the journey, you move into the next ring on the spiral, so to speak. And when you start to see this within yourself, then you can have a much deeper understanding of what awakening is. And then you can start to realize that there's going to be a time where you get lost in form. There's going to be a time where you get absorbed in your project. There's going to be a time where you get absorbed in your self-identity. There's going to be then a time where you want nothing to do with that identity, and then there's going to be a time where you integrate both of those. And then boom, you're on to the next level. Yeah, so as I was saying, you move to the next level once you've integrated this trinity. And then what happens? You go and explore this new version of your identity. And you might get lost in that. You might get lost in your projects or with your relationships. And then you wake up from that, and then you integrate that, and then so on and so forth. So the point of this message is that a lot of people, when we think about spirituality and we think about our approach to spirituality, we want to remain unattached from the world. But in my experience, it's more beneficial to allow yourself to really commit to what's happening in the world of form. So that by virtue of you fully committing, life will then find a way, for the sake of love, to kind of slap your hand away from whatever you're grabbing at, so that you can then be relinquished of that identification, and you can find a point of balance. So that's just the message, is that we need to not be afraid of really getting into life on a physical level. You know, a lot of people that are first waking up out of ego, they're like, I want nothing to do with the world. And I go, okay, that's fine for now, but you'll come back. And the point of completing that cycle is to come back. It's like the second coming of Christ, right? Like, he dies, that whole story, and then he comes back. It's the resurrection. So a lot of people right now that I seem to be, that seem to come to me in the sessions and message me from watching my YouTube videos and stuff, it's like a lot of people are at that phase where they just woke up out of that unconscious state of reality, and they want nothing to do with it, and they have no sort of sense of direction and what is going on and all this stuff. What's going on is that we're finding out how to integrate the world, the material world and the spiritual world. So allow that process to occur. And it's a beautiful part of ascension. That's the message.
Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I could add to that. Just to simplify it a little bit more. So it's the idea that, like, so just leading to, like, thinking of, like, Buddhist philosophy and stuff like that is, like, okay, like, non-attachment. Don't be attached to things. Or, like, I can add to what he was saying. And it's basically the idea of like being unattached and not having necessarily any expectations from your life and your reality, but still being fully engaged and passionate and motivated about just existing, and the idea that you exist and that you can do things and you could create things.
It's fun.
Or you could hang out with other people and just experience being a human, and still being fully passionate, engaged with that idea of experiencing being human, but still being unattached in the sense that you can't be destroyed by anything that's like a cause of your life and humanity. Like, oh, this happened, that was really bad, and da 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 da, and now I'm depressed and traumatized. But it's like that idea of, okay, you could be non-attached in that sense, but it doesn't stop you from being fully engaged. And I think that's something that's really important. That's going based off of what he was saying. Yeah.
I love that message. I feel like for a lot of spiritual people, it's very difficult to integrate with.
Yeah,
the physical world.
It is. It is, and actually, just to add to that, people want to know how to actually integrate into that, and in my experience, the most direct way is to begin to uncover what your heart really wants, what you're really passionate about, begin to really discover and to decipher what you're passionate about in your life, and by virtue of that discovery, really commit to that and make that your purpose. Even if the purpose changes, having purpose and seeing the bigger picture that we're here to really transform this planet in whatever way is unique to us, that thing helps you almost instantaneously come back into the physical realm, because you're driven by transforming the physical realm. And we all do that in a different way, and ultimately we need to do that in a way that's most resonant to our unique self and to our creativity. So whenever that process is occurring, you don't really know what to do about that. Really begin to do your best to discern what it is you actually want in your life, and really devote yourself to that thing, with fully acknowledging the fact that that thing might change. And it's all good if it does change, but for the time being, really go into that. A lot of people are in limbo. And limbo is a great place to be, but you don't want to be in limbo forever. You want to really start distributing energy to these different parts of your life, and so that you can move to the next part of your journey. Is there anything you want to add to that? Okay. Yeah, that's it.
I think that's a very beautiful message to end this video
Cool.
on. And I deeply appreciate you both coming here. It was so informative.
Awesome.
I deeply appreciate it.
We deeply appreciate you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, it's been awesome. Thank you.